The sound of a laser pointer clicking against a projection screen should not sound like a gunshot, but in that small, airless conference room on the fourth floor of the bioscience building, it did. Click, silence, click. I stood there, frozen. My hand was still extended toward the screen, trembling just enough that the red dot of the laser was dancing a frantic jitterbug across the graph I had spent the last 18 months of my life generating. The graph that was supposed to earn me my doctorate. The graph that was supposed to be my ticket out of academic poverty and into a real career. "I'm sorry, Kenji," a voice said. It wasn't a question, it was a sledgehammer. I turned slowly. My neck felt stiff, like the muscles were turning to stone. Sitting at the head of the mahogany table was Dr. Vance, my advisor, my mentor. The man who had invited me to Thanksgiving dinner 3 years in a row because my family was back in Oregon and he didn't want me eating ramen alone. He wasn't smiling. He had that look he always used during grant reviews. Furrowed brows, lips pursed in faux concern, glasses perched right at the end of his nose. He looked like a disappointed father. He looked like he was doing this for my own good. "Dr. Vance." I managed to croak out. My throat felt like I'd swallowed a handful of dry sand. Is there a problem with the standard deviation?" The other 4 members of the dissertation committee shifted in their chairs. I heard the squeak of leather. Dr. Aris, the department head, looked down at his notepad, suddenly finding his pen very interesting. That was the first red flag. Usually, Aris loved tearing students apart. If he wasn't making eye contact, something was wrong. Something was fatal. Vance sighed. He took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. The theatricality of it made my stomach turn. "It's not the deviation, Kenji," Vance said softly. His voice was smooth, baritone, practiced. It was the voice that won grants. "It's the data itself." "I don't understand," I said. "I ran the Western blots myself. I processed the raw sequencing data on the cluster. The logs are in the supplementary materials." Vance reached into his leather briefcase, the expensive one, Italian leather, a gift from a pharmaceutical rep, and pulled out a bound manuscript. It wasn't my thesis. It was a hardcover proof. The glossy jacket caught the harsh fluorescent lights of the room. "This is the advanced copy of my upcoming book on neural pathway degeneration," Vance said, placing it on the table with a heavy thud. "It's scheduled for release next month. The publishers have had the final manuscript for nearly half a year." My ears started to ring, a high-pitched whine, like an old CRT television. "Okay," I said. I could feel sweat trickling down my spine, cold and clammy. "I'm looking forward to reading it." "Kenji, please," Vance said, his voice sharpening just a fraction. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." He opened the book. He flipped to a bookmarked page near the center. He spun the book around and slid it across the polished wood until it rested right in front of me. I looked down. There it was. Figure 4.2. It was my graph. Not a similar graph, not a replication. It was my graph. It had the same exact outlier in the 3rd quadrant that I had agonized over removing but decided to keep for integrity. It had the specific color gradient I had custom-coded in Python because the default MATLAB plub colors were ugly. "I wish you could look for the world." "What?" "This is my data," I whispered. "No, Kenji," Vance said, his voice dropping to a register of pure disappointed authority. "That is data from the lab's core project. Data I generated 2 years ago. Data I shared with you to help you practice your analysis techniques." I stared at him. The room seemed to tilt. "What? No, that's a lie. I ran the mice. I did the staining. I have the notebooks. They're in the lab right now." Vance looked at Dr. Aris. "I told you this might happen," Vance said to the committee. "I was worried he had confused the training set with his own independent work." I tried to correct him during our weekly meetings, but, well, Kenji has always been a bit stubborn. "You never corrected me," I shouted. The volume surprised me. It echoed off the whiteboard. "You told me this was breakthrough work. You told me last week that I was a shoo-in for the postdoc at Stanford." "Lower your voice, Mr. Sato," Dr. Aris snapped. He finally looked up. His eyes were cold. "Accusations of academic dishonesty are serious. Are you accusing Dr. Vance, a tenured chair of this department, of stealing data from a grad student?" I looked around the room. I looked at the faces of the committee. Dr. Wu was looking at her watch. Dr. Miller was staring at the wall. Dr. Aris was glaring at me, and Vance, Vance was looking right at me, and for a split second, the disappointed father mask slipped. Just for a microsecond, underneath there was a smirk, a tiny predatory curl of the lip. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knew I kept my raw data on the shared lab server, the server he had administrator access to. He knew I didn't print hard copies of the raw logs because we're a green lab, Kenji, save paper. He knew my backups were on a hard drive that was currently sitting in my desk drawer in the office he had the keys to. I'm not accusing him, I said, my voice trembling. I'm stating a fact. That is my work. It's in a published book, Kenji, Vance said, tapping the cover. Copyrighted, peer-reviewed, dated 6 months ago. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. Now Vance continued, we have two options. Option A, you admit you made a mistake. You confuse the files. We suspend your defense. You take a year off, maybe rewrite your thesis on a different topic. We sweep this embarrassing outburst under the rug. He paused. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Or option B, he said, his voice like ice. We proceed with an academic integrity hearing. I bring up the timestamps on my manuscript. You bring whatever notes you have. And when you lose, and you will lose, Kenji, you will be expelled. No PhD, no master's, no career. You won't even get a job washing beakers in a high school chem lab. I looked at the graph on the screen behind me. The red laser dot was gone because I had dropped the pointer. It had rolled under the table. I looked at the book. I looked at the man I had trusted with my future. I realized then that this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a harvest. I wasn't a student to him. I was livestock. And he had just decided it was time to slaughter me for the meat. I felt bile rise in my throat. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to smash his smug face with his own book. But I didn't. Because in that moment, staring at the outlier on the graph, that one tiny dot in the third quadrant, I remembered something. I remembered something about that specific data point that Vance evidently didn't know. Something I hadn't put in the lab notebook. Something I hadn't uploaded to the server. I took a deep breath. I picked up my water bottle. My hand was still shaking, but my mind was suddenly crystal clear. I think I need a moment, I said quietly. Take all the time you need to pack up, Vance said dismissively. But I wasn't packing up. I was just getting started. But to explain how I caught him, I have to go back. Back to the day I walked into Vance's lab, wide-eyed and stupid, thinking hard work actually mattered. Let me back up. 5 years ago, getting into the Vance lab felt like winning the lottery. I remember the day I got the acceptance email. I was sitting in a cramped coffee shop in Portland, refreshing my inbox every 30 seconds. When the notification popped up, I literally screamed. People stared. I didn't care. Dr. Vance wasn't just a professor. He was a rock star in the world of neuroscience. His TED Talk on synaptic plasticity had 5 million views. He was young, charismatic, and supposedly revolutionary. Every grad student in the country wanted a bench in his lab. He only took one per year. That year, he picked me. I walked into his office for the first time feeling like I was entering a temple. The room was designed to intimidate and impress. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with first editions. A view of the campus quad that probably cost the university an extra 10 grand a year. And there was Vance, sitting behind a glass desk that looked invisible, smiling that winning smile. Kenji, he had said, standing up to shake my hand. Welcome to the big leagues. We're going to change the world, you and I. I believed him. God, I was so naive. I was 23 years old, hungry for approval, and desperate to prove that a kid from a blue-collar family could hang with the academic elites. Vance smelled that desperation on me like a shark smells blood in the water. The first 2 years were grueling, but in a way that felt necessary. I worked 80-hour weeks. That's not an exaggeration. I practically lived in the vivarium, the basement facility where we kept the test mice. It smelled of sawdust, ammonia, and recycled air. It was a windowless bunker, and it became my entire world. Vance was different from the other professors. He didn't hover. He was the cool dad of the department. He'd come down to the lab at 7 p.m. on a Friday with a 6-pack of craft beer. He'd sit on a lab stool, loosen his tie, and ask about my life. He asked about my parents. He asked about my student loans. He listened. "You're the hardest worker I've ever seen, Kenji," he told me once, clinking his bottle against my beaker of distilled water. "Most of these kids, they're tourists. I want the degree, but they don't want the pain. You embrace the pain. That's why you're going to be better than me one day." That sentence became my fuel. When I was hallucinating from sleep deprivation at 4 a.m., trying to manually count neurons on a microscopic slide, I replayed his voice in my head. Better than me. But looking back, I see the grooming. I see how he slowly isolated me. It started subtly. "Don't discuss your preliminary data with the other grad students," he'd say. "They're competitive, Kenji. They'll scoop you. Intellectual property is a war zone. Trust no one." So I stopped talking to my peers. I stopped going to the department mixers. I became a ghost, haunting the lab, hoarding my data like a dragon sitting on gold. And the only person I shared that gold with was Vance. By my 3rd year, we started the Atlas project. This was the big one, the thesis project. We were trying to map a specific neural pathway linked to early onset Alzheimer's. If we succeeded, it would be the cover of Nature. It would guarantee grants for the next decade. The work was technically impossible for most labs. It required a technique called viral tracing, combined with custom coding to analyze terabytes of imaging data. I had to learn Python from scratch. I had to build my own imaging rig because the university's standard equipment wasn't sensitive enough. Vance provided the funding, but I provided the sweat. He provided the vision. I provided the reality. During this time, Vance stopped coming to the lab as much. He was busy securing our future, he said. He was flying to conferences in Zurich, Tokyo, and Boston. He was writing books. He was being a public intellectual. "I'm clearing the path for you, Kenji," he'd say over Skype, calling from a hotel room that cost more than my monthly rent. "I'm building the hype so that when you drop this data, the world is ready to catch it." Then came the security talk. This was the linchpin of his plan. It was a rainy Tuesday. Vance called me into his office and closed the door. He looked serious. He pulled down the blinds. "I've heard rumors," he said, keeping his voice low. "There's a lab at MIT working on something very similar to the Atlas project. We have a leak." My stomach dropped. "A leak? Who? I don't know," Vance said. "But we can't take risks. From now on, Kenji, I don't want your data on the university cloud. IT has access to that. The admins have access. It's not safe." "Where should I put it?" I asked. "I've set up a private server," he said. "Encrypted, off-grid, physically located in my home office, but you can access it via a VPN tunnel I've set up. Upload everything there, raw images, code, manuscript drafts, everything. Delete the local copies on the lab computers once the upload is confirmed. We go dark until publication." It sounded like a spy movie. It sounded exciting. It made me feel important. "We go dark." I did exactly what he asked. For 2 years, every single byte of data I generated went straight to his private server. I wiped the lab computers daily. I kept no paper trail because Vance insisted that paper can be photographed. I was handing him the keys to the castle, and I was thanking him for taking them. The dynamic shifted in my 4th year. The data started to look good, really good. I remember the night I finally cracked the code for the visualization. I ran the script, and the screen filled with a 3D rotating model of the neural pathway. It was beautiful. It glowed neon blue and green against the black background. It was the first time anyone in human history had seen this specific structure. I called Vance immediately. It was 2 a.m. He answered on the first ring. "I got it," I breathed. "It works." He drove to the lab in his pajamas. He stared at the screen for a long time. The reflection of the glowing neurons danced in his glasses. He didn't say, "Good job, Kenji." He didn't say, "We did it." He touched the screen with his finger, tracing the line of the pathway. "This is it," he whispered. "This is the tenure chair. This is the book deal." I thought he was speaking metaphorically. I thought he meant our success. I didn't notice that he never mentioned my graduation. He only mentioned the rewards that would accrue to him. Upload the final data set, he ordered, his eyes still glued to the screen. Right now. I want to secure this before sunrise. I initiated the transfer, 400 gigabytes of high-resolution TIFF files and 50,000 lines of Python code. I watched the progress bar crawl from 0% to 100%. Done, I said. Vance patted me on the shoulder. It was a heavy, possessive pat. You're a soldier, Kenji. Go home. Sleep. You've earned it. He stayed behind. I walked out to the parking lot that morning as the sun was coming up. The sky was a bruised purple. I felt lighter than air. I drove home, collapsed onto my mattress, and slept for 16 hours. I dreamed of graduation. I dreamed of my parents sitting in the front row, watching me get hooded. I dreamed of being called Dr. Sato. I didn't know that while I was sleeping, Vance was already at work. He wasn't analyzing the data. He was renaming files. He was stripping metadata. He was changing the author tag and the document properties from Kenji Sato to system admin. He wasn't securing the discovery. He was sanitizing it. The next few months were weird. Vance became distant. Whenever I asked about scheduling my defense date, he was evasive. We need to be perfect, he'd say. The committee is tough. Give me another month to review the drafts. I've sent you 10 drafts, I argued. You haven't sent back a single edit. I'm digesting it, Kenji. Genius takes time, he'd snap, then smooth his tone. Trust the process. I'm on your side. I trusted the process. I trusted him. Even when I saw him having lunch with the dean, laughing and showing something on his iPad that looked suspiciously like my 3D model. Even when I saw the invoice for a professional medical illustrator on his desk, something a grad student budget could never afford, I ignored the gut feeling that something was wrong because the alternative was too terrifying to consider. If Vance was lying, my life was over, so I decided he wasn't lying. I gaslit myself. I spent those final months refining the supplementary data. This is the boring stuff nobody reads. The raw logs, the error rate calculations, the boring Excel sheets of mouse weights. Vance didn't care about this stuff. He only cared about the glossy images and the big conclusions. So, mostly out of boredom and anxiety, I started playing with the raw numbers. I was obsessive. I wanted to see if I could find patterns in the noise, and that's when I found the fingerprint. It wasn't intentional. It was a mathematical artifact, a tiny, recurring glitch in the sequencing machine that happened every time the temperature in the room rose about 72 degrees. It created a specific, predictable error in the 400th decimal point of the data. It was invisible to the naked eye. It didn't change the results, but it was there, like a watermark. I was about to tell Vance about it. I wrote an email. Subject, weird artifact in sequencing data. My finger hovered over the send button, but then I remembered something he said to me a week earlier. I had asked for a letter of recommendation for a fellowship, and he had sighed, looking annoyed. Let's focus on what you can do for me right now, Kenji, not what I can do for you. It was a small thing, but it stung. I didn't send the email. I deleted the draft. I thought, I'll fix it later. Thank God I deleted that draft, because that tiny invisible glitch, that temperature error in the 400th decimal point, was about to become the most important weapon in my life. But I didn't know that yet. I was still walking into the slaughterhouse smiling, waiting for my mentor to open the door. The first time the knife went in, it was so subtle I barely felt the blade. It was the annual departmental symposium. This was usually a low-stakes event, just a chance for the various labs to show off what they'd been doing over the summer. There were cheap sandwiches, lukewarm coffee, and rows of posters lined up in the atrium. I had spent 3 days designing my poster. I'd used the high-res 3D neural maps, the ones that looked like cosmic nebulae inside a skull. I was proud of them. I was the lead author listed on the poster, Kenji Sato, Dr. Harrison Vance. I was standing near the refreshment table, adjusting my tie and feeling like a real scientist, when I saw a crowd gathering around the main podium. Dr. Vance was there. He wasn't at our poster. He was on the stage, giving an unscheduled brief update on the lab's progress. I've been working on something transformative, Vance told the room. His voice was projected with that effortless confidence that always made me feel small. I call it the Vance mapping protocol. It's a way to bypass the standard limitations of viral tracing. My heart did a strange little flip-flop. The Vance mapping protocol, that was the code I'd written, the one I'd named Sato_trace v4.pi on the server. He clicked his remote, and there it was, my 3D model projected 30 feet wide on the atrium wall. The crowd gasped. It was beautiful. But at the bottom of the slide, in small but clear font, it said, "Image courtesy of the Vance Laboratory. Lead investigator, Dr. Harrison Vance." My name wasn't there. Not in the credits. Nowhere. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. After the presentation, while a circle of professors was congratulating him, I managed to pull him aside. "Dr. Vance," I whispered, my voice shaking. "The slides. My name wasn't on the mapping protocol." "I thought we discussed." He didn't even let me finish. He put a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, just a little too firm. He leaned in, smelling an expensive cologne and espresso. Kenji, he said with a small, patronizing chuckle. This was a high-level overview for the administration. They don't want to get bogged down in the names of every lab tech and assistant. It's about the Vance Lab brand. When the paper comes out, you'll be there. Don't be so sensitive. It makes you look unprofessional. You want a career, don't you? He patted my cheek, a light, humiliating tap, and turned back to his colleagues before I could say another word. I stood there in the middle of the crowded atrium, feeling invisible. Lab tech, assistant. I was the one who had spent 6 months failing at that code before it finally worked. I was the one who had the scars on my hands from building the imaging rig. But I let it go. I told myself he was right. I was just a student. He was the brand. That's how the game was played, right? The next few months, the game got uglier. Vance started asking me to do things that felt off. He'd come into the lab with a stack of papers and say, "Kenji, I have this guest lecture at the University of Chicago. I need you to prep the slides. Use the raw data from the Atlas project, but strip the watermarks. It looks cleaner on the big screen. But the watermarks have the timestamps, I'd say. It's for the audit trail. I have the audit trail on my server, Kenji." He'd bark, his patience thinning. "Just do it. And while you're at it, I need a 3-page summary of the methodology. Write it in the first person." I observed. It makes the lecture more engaging for the undergrads. I spent my nights ghostwriting his lectures. I watched via Zoom as he delivered my words, my insights, and my discoveries to cheering audiences while I sat in my dark apartment eating cold noodles. The gaslighting became a daily occurrence. If I pointed out an error in how he described the data, he'd turn it back on me. "Are you sure you understood the math, Kenji? Maybe your lack of sleep is making you paranoid. Perhaps we should push back your defense another 6 months. You don't seem mentally stable enough for the committee yet." That was the ultimate threat, the defense date. It was the carrot he dangled in front of me and the stick he used to beat me. Every time I pushed back, he threatened to delay my graduation, and I couldn't afford a delay. My student loans were coming due. My parents were getting older. They were bragging to the whole neighborhood about their son, the soon-to-be doctor. The pressure was a physical weight in my chest, making it hard to breathe. In late November, the rising tension reached a boiling point. I was in the lab late, as usual, when I noticed Vance had left his office door ajar. I knew I shouldn't go in. But I needed a stapler, or at least that's the excuse I gave myself. I walked in. The office was dark, lit only by the glowing screens of his dual monitor setup. He was logged into the private server, my server. Curiosity, or maybe a subconscious need for self-preservation, took over. I walked behind his desk. He had a folder open, labeled Book Manuscript Final. My heart hammered against my ribs. I clicked it. It was a draft for a book titled The New Architecture of the Mind. I scrolled through the chapters. Chapter 7 was titled The Vance Mapping Breakthrough. I started reading. My vision began to blur. It was my data. It was my writing. He had taken my monthly progress reports, the long, detailed emails I sent him every Friday, and he had copy-pasted them directly into the manuscript. He hadn't even changed the adjectives. He'd taken my descriptions of the neural pathways, my analogies about synaptic bridges, my entire theoretical framework, and my name. It wasn't in the chapter. It wasn't in the footnotes. I scrolled to the preface. Surely he'd thank me there. I would like to thank the various lab assistants who helped with the menial data collection over the years. That was it. I was a lab assistant who did menial data collection. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. It was a cold fire, starting in my gut and spreading to my fingertips. I wanted to delete the file. I wanted to format the whole server. But then I heard footsteps in the hall, the heavy rhythmic click of Vance's Italian loafers. I scrambled out of the office, ducking into the supply closet just as he turned the corner. I watched through the slat in the closet door as he entered his office, humming a jaunty tune, and closed the door. I stood in the dark, surrounded by boxes of nitrile gloves and pipette tips, and I realized the truth. Vance wasn't just scooping me, he was erasing me. By the time I defended my thesis, his book would already be out. He would be the inventor of the protocol. If I tried to claim it was mine after the book was published, I would look like a disgruntled student trying to steal credit from a famous professor. He was building a cage, and the bars were made of my own work. I went back to my bench that night, but I didn't work on the thesis. I sat there, staring at the raw data logs. I thought about the fingerprint, the temperature base glitch in the 400th decimal point. I opened the Python script I used to clean the data. Usually, I used a function called clean artifacts to smooth out those tiny errors before the final visualization. It was a standard procedure. It made the data pure. But what if I didn't clean it? What if I created a new version of the dataset? One that looked identical on the surface, identical 3D models, identical graphs, but was fundamentally poisoned at the level of the raw code. I started to think like a saboteur. If Vance was copy-pasting my work, he was doing it blindly. He didn't understand the underlying math. He just liked the results. He was a thief, and thieves are often lazy. I spent the next 6 hours creating a punch, ghost data set. I injected a specific, repeating mathematical sequence into the noise of the data. To anyone looking at the graphs, it was perfect. But if you ran a Fourier transform, a specific type of mathematical analysis, on the raw numbers, the noise wouldn't be random. It would spell out a message. In the 400th decimal point, if you converted the numbers to ASCII code, it repeated the same 3 words over and over again. Stolen from Sato, stolen from Sato, stolen from Sato. It was a digital watermark, buried so deep that no one would ever find it unless they knew exactly where to look. And Vance would never look. He was too busy picking out the suit for his book tour. I uploaded the ghost dataset to the private server, replacing my original files. I felt a grim sense of satisfaction as the upload complete box popped up. I was still in danger. I was still being robbed, but for the first time in years, I wasn't just a victim. I was a trap. I walked out of the lab at 5 a.m. The winter air was biting, but I didn't feel the cold. I looked up at the lighted window of Vance's office. "Go ahead, Harrison," I whispered into the wind. "Take it. It's all yours." The breaking point didn't happen with a shout. It happened with a smile and a cup of expensive artisan coffee. It was a Monday morning, exactly 3 weeks before my scheduled defense date. I had spent the entire weekend polishing my slides, using the ghost dataset I'd planted on the server. I was exhausted. My eyes were bloodshot from staring at blue light screens, but I felt a strange, manic energy. I was ready to end this. I was in the lab calibrating the centrifuge when Vance's assistant, a freshman who looked like he'd never seen a day of hard work in his life, tapped me on the shoulder. "Dr. Vance wants to see you," the kid said. "He said to bring your laptop and your external drives." My stomach did a slow, sickening roll. "All the drives?" I walked into Vance's office. He was sitting there basking in the morning sun, holding a steaming cup of Coma coffee. On his desk sat a stack of glossy postcards. I looked closer. They were promotional flyers for a university-wide gala event, celebrating the publication of The New Architecture of the Mind by Dr. Harrison Vance. The date on the flyer was the day after my defense. "Sit down, Kenji," Vance said. He didn't look up from his iPad. He let me sit there in silence for a full minute, the only sound the hum of his designer air purifier. Finally, he set the iPad down and looked at me. His eyes were different today. The cool mentor act was gone. They were flat, clinical, like he was looking at a biological specimen that had outlived its usefulness. "I've been reviewing your final thesis draft," he said, gesturing to a printed copy on his desk. It was covered in red ink. But it wasn't editing ink. There were huge diagonal slashes through entire chapters. "It's not good, Kenji. In fact, it's a disaster." I felt the blood drain from my face. A disaster. "Dr. Vance, you said last month the methodology was the strongest you'd ever seen. I said what you needed to hear to keep the lab running," he interrupted, his voice cold and precise. "But looking at it now, with fresh eyes, the logic is flawed. Your interpretation of the neural mapping is speculative at best. It's amateurish. If I let you stand in front of the committee with this, you'd be laughed out of the building. It would reflect poorly on me, and I can't have that." I stared at the red slashes on the pages. He had crossed out the very sections he had copy-pasted into his own book. "So, what are you saying?" I asked. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "I'm saying you aren't ready," Vance said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass desk. "I've already spoken to Dr. Harris and the rest of the committee. We're canceling your defense date for this semester." "Canceling? But I have a job offer. I have a postdoc lined up." "You had a job offer," Vance corrected. "I've already sent a courtesy note to my colleagues at Stanford, letting them know that your work requires significant remediation. They've withdrawn the offer." The world seemed to fracture. Everything I had worked for, the 80-hour weeks, the missed holidays, the debt, the isolation, it was being erased by a man sipping coffee. "You can't do that," I whispered. "That's my work. You're using it in your book." I saw the manuscript, Vance. I saw Chapter 7. The air in the room suddenly felt very heavy. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't even look surprised. He just slowly set his coffee cup down and stood up. He walked over to the door and locked it. Click. "Let's stop pretending, Kenji," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous snarl. "You're a smart kid. You found the manuscript. Fine, but let's look at the reality of your situation. You have no copies of that data. I checked your lab bench last night. I checked your cloud accounts. You've been a very good boy. You followed my security protocols to the letter. Everything is on my server. Everything is under my encryption." He walked behind me, his hand resting on the back of my chair. I could feel the heat radiating from him. In the eyes of the university, Vance continued, "I am the principal investigator. I own the intellectual property. If you try to tell anyone that I stole from you, I will simply show them the timestamps on my manuscript, which, as you know, predates your thesisception by months. I will tell them you became obsessed, that you tried to plagiarize my work to pass your defense, and that I had to step in to protect the integrity of the department. They won't believe you," I said, but even I could hear the lack of conviction in my voice. "They will," Vance laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "I bring in $6 million a year in grant money. You bring in, what, a bill for more pipette tips. The dean is my golf partner, Kenji. Eris owes his tenure to my recommendation. Who are they going to choose? A prestigious, world-renowned author or a mentally unstable grad student who couldn't handle the pressure?" He leaned down, his face inches from mine. "Here is what is going to happen," he said. "You are going to hand over those external drives right now. You are going to sign a voluntary withdrawal form from the PhD program, citing personal health reasons. In exchange, I won't file formal plagiarism charges against you. You can leave with your master's degree and disappear. If you fight me, I will destroy you so thoroughly you won't be able to get a job at a Starbucks." I looked at his iPad. A notification popped up on the screen. Email from Nature Journal. Final proofs for review. He was taking it all. Every single bit of it. I looked at the external drives in my bag. They were empty. I had wiped them the night before, replacing the data with junk files and old movies renamed to look like datasets. But he didn't know that. I felt a wave of nausea, followed by a strange cold clarity. This was the moment, the breaking point. I could either break or I could become the hammer. I need a day, I said, to think. Vance smirked. He thought he'd won. He thought he'd broken my spirit. You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow. If those drives and the signed withdrawal aren't on my desk by then, I call the Academic Integrity Board. I stood up. My legs felt like lead. I walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped out into the hallway. I didn't go back to the lab. I went to the campus library, the basement level, where nobody does. I sat in a carrel and opened my laptop. I checked the server logs via my hidden portal. Vance was already in there. He was downloading the ghost dataset. He was moving it into the final submission folder for the Nature paper. He was so eager to finalize his theft that he wasn't even checking the file sizes. I watched the progress bar on my screen. Downloading A8%, 94%, 100%. He had taken the bait. He had just injected stolen from Sato into the very foundation of his career. But I wasn't done. If I just let him publish it, it would take years for someone to find the watermark. I didn't have years. I needed the explosion to happen now. I needed it to happen during the defense, the one he thought he had canceled. I opened my email. I didn't write to Vance. I wrote to Dr. Eris, the department head. Subject: formal grievance and request for public defense. In the email, I didn't accuse Vance of theft. Not yet. I played the role of the humble, confused student. I told Eris that Dr. Vance was concerned about the data, but that I had found a significant anomaly that proved the work was valid. I told him that I felt a public defense was the only way to clear my name and prove the lab's success before the book launch. IBCC's the Dean of Research. IBCC's the university's legal counsel. I knew Eris. He was a man who hated scandal but loved prestige. By bringing in the big guns early, I made it impossible for him to sweep it under the rug. He would be forced to allow the defense to proceed, if only to prove the university's excellence. Then, I did the hardest thing I've ever done. I called my parents. "Hey, Ma," I said, my voice cracking. "Kenji, we're already packing for the flight. Your father bought a new suit for the ceremony. Dr. Sato, we're so proud." I closed my eyes. Tears were stinging now. Yeah, Ma, it's gonna be a big day. Just make sure you're there early. Front row, I want you to see everything. I hung up. I had no backup plan if my ghost data saw didn't work, or if Vance was smarter than I gave him credit for. I was going to be humiliated in front of my family and expelled in the same hour. I spent the rest of the night in that library basement. I wasn't studying. I was writing a small script, a trigger. It was a simple piece of code. If I plugged a specific USB drive into the presentation computer, it would run a Fourier transform on any open data file. It would strip away the visual layer of the graphs and display the raw ASCII code in giant 72-point font on the projector screen. It was a digital guillotine, and I was the one pulling the rope. At 8:55 a.m. the next morning, I walked toward Vance's office. I didn't have the drives. I didn't have the withdrawal form. I had a flash drive in my pocket and the cold, hard weight of 5 years of stolen life in my heart. The defense was still on. He just didn't know it was his defense, not mine. The most dangerous thing in the world is a man who thinks he has already won. When I walked into Vance's office at 9 a.m., I didn't look like a rebel. I looked like a ghost. I had spent the last hour in the bathroom splashing cold water on my face and practicing my broken expression in the mirror. I needed to look defeated. I needed to look like the unstable student he had described to the dean. Vance was leaning back in his chair, feet on the desk, scrolling through his phone. He didn't even look up when I entered. "Do you have the papers, Kenji?" he asked, his voice airy and bored. I couldn't do it, I said, my voice cracking perfectly. I couldn't sign them. Not yet. Vance sighed, a sound of exaggerated parental disappointment. He finally looked up, his eyes narrowing behind his designer frames. We talked about this, Kenji. Don't make me call the board. I have the plagiarism report ready to go. One click, and you're blacklisted from academia forever. I know, I whispered, staring at my shoes. But I talked to Dr. Eris. I told him I had a final breakthrough. I told him I could prove the data was sound. He insisted on the public defense. He said the university needs the prestige of the Atlas Project before the book launch. Vance froze. The smug relaxation left his body instantly. He dropped his feet to the floor and stood up, leaning over the desk. You did what? I told you to stay away from Eris. I'm sorry, I cried out, injecting a note of panic into my voice. I was scared. I thought if I could just show him the final 3D renders, the ones you liked, he would help me. But he told me that since the defense was already on the university calendar and guests were invited, canceling it now would cause an inquiry. He doesn't want the dean looking into the lab's records. I watched Vance's brain work. I could almost see the gears turning. He was calculating. If he forced the cancellation now, Eris would get suspicious. An inquiry meant auditors. Auditors meant looking at the raw logs on his private server. That was the one thing Vance couldn't allow. But if the defense proceeded, he's right, Vance muttered, more to himself than to me. He started pacing the length of his office. A cancellation looks like a scandal. A public defense looks like a victory lap. He stopped and looked at me. A predatory light flickered in his eyes. Fine, we'll do the defense, but you won't be presenting your work, Kenji. You'll be presenting the lab's work. My work. You will use the final slides I've prepared. You will follow the script I give you. You will stand there, look pretty, and let the committee praise the Vance mapping protocol. If you deviate by one word, I will personally see to it that you leave this campus in handcuffs. Yes, Dr. Vance, I said, bowing my head. Anything. Just please don't take my masters away. Get out, he snapped. And send me your final PowerPoint file by 5 p.m. I'm going to personally scrub it for any errors you might have accidentally left in. I left his office and felt the adrenaline surge. Step 1 was complete. I had used his fear of an audit to force him into the one arena where I had control, the presentation computer. I spent the next 12 hours in a state of hyper-focused calm. I wasn't just a student anymore. I was an engineer, building a bomb. The ghost dataset was already on the server. I knew Vance would download it and scrub it, but as I'd suspected, his scrubbing was superficial. He looked at the labels, the titles, and the visual aesthetics. He didn't have the technical skill to look at the underlying Python arrays. He was a big picture man, which in science is often just a code word for lazy. But I needed to be sure the trigger worked on the auditorium's hardware. At midnight, I used my master key to slip into the main science hall. The auditorium was vast, a sea of empty wooden seats that would soon be filled with my peers, my enemies, and my parents. I walked up to the podium. My heart was thumping against my ribs like a trapped bird. I plugged my trigger USB into the port hidden under the desk. I opened a dummy data file, a massive spreadsheet of random numbers. I tapped a specific sequence on the keyboard, CT plus S plus T plus O. Suddenly, the projector screen flickered. The spreadsheet vanished. In its place, the computer began to execute a deep Fourier analysis. Because the dummy data was random, the screen filled with white noise. But tomorrow, when I ran it on the ghost dataset, it wouldn't be noise. It would be my name, over and over. A mathematical proof of theft that no one could deny. I stayed in that auditorium for hours, practicing my movements. I wasn't practicing a speech. I was practicing a heist. I had to know exactly when to plug in the drive, exactly how to position my body, so Vance, who would be sitting on the stage with the committee, couldn't see what I was doing on the laptop. As I worked, I thought about the ethics of what I was doing. I was about to destroy a man's life. I was about to cause a scandal that would rock the university. People would lose their jobs. The lab would be shut down. My fellow grad students, the few I still considered friends, would have their research stalled. But then I remembered the lab assistant comment in the book. I remembered the cold way he had called Stanford to kill my job offer. I remembered the 5 years of my life I had spent in that windowless basement, breathing in ammonia and sawdust, while he took the credit, the money, and the fame. He wasn't a scientist. He was a parasite, and sometimes to save the host, you have to kill the parasite. At 4 a.m., I went to the 24-hour diner near campus. I ordered a black coffee and sat by the window. I pulled out the script Vance had sent me. It was nauseating. It was 15 pages of self-congratulatory drivel. As I first hypothesized in my early years at Harvard, my unique approach to synaptic mapping, the Vance protocol represents a shift in the paradigm. He had even written my conclusion. For me, it ended with, "I want to thank Dr. Vance for his visionary leadership, without which this work would have been impossible." I smiled. It was the first real smile I'd had in months. "Oh, Harrison," I whispered, tearing the script into tiny pieces and dropping them into the dregs of my coffee. "It's going to be impossible, all right." I went home, showered, and put on the suit my parents had bought me. It was a bit too big for me. I'd lost weight from the stress, but I looked the part. I checked my pocket. The USB drive was there. I checked my other pocket. A printed copy of the Ghost dataset. Source code was there. I drove to the campus. The parking lot was already starting to fill up. I saw a silver Mercedes pull into the reserved spot near the entrance. Vance. He stepped out looking like $1 million in a tailored navy suit. He looked at me, gave a sharp, confident nod, and walked inside. He thought this was his coronation. A few minutes later, an old, beat-up Toyota pulled in. My parents stepped out. My dad was wearing a suit that was 20 years out of style, and my mom was holding a camera like it was a holy relic. They saw me and waved frantically, their faces beaming with a pride that made my chest ache. I realized then that there was no turning back. If I failed, I wasn't just failing myself. I was failing them. I was the first person in our family to go to college, let alone get a doctorate. To them, this was the American dream made real. I walked toward the hall. My hands were perfectly steady. The stage was set. The audience was waiting. The committee was seated, and the Vance mapping protocol was about to meet its maker. I stepped into the auditorium, the heavy oak doors closing behind me with a definitive thud. The hunt was over. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was pull the cord. The air in the auditorium felt electric, thick with the smell of old wood, floor wax, and the hushed murmurs of 200 people. I stood at the side of the stage, watching the room fill up. Vance was already at the committee table, center stage. He looked like royalty. He was chatting with Dr. Eris, laughing at some private joke, leaning back with a proprietary air that said, "This is my house." My parents were in the third row. My mother had her camera out, lens cap already off, her eyes fixed on me with a terrifyingly pure hope. "Mr. Sato," Dr. Aris's voice boomed through the PA system. "We are ready to begin." I walked to the podium. My shoes clicked on the polished floor, a lonely, rhythmic sound. I didn't look at the audience. I looked at the laptop. "Thank you, Dr. Eris. Members of the committee, Dr. Vance." I nodded toward him. He gave me a sharp, warning look, a reminder of the script I was supposed to follow. I hit the space bar. The first slide flickered onto the massive screen behind me. The architecture of neural degeneration, a new mapping protocol. For the first 20 minutes, I gave the performance of my life. I delivered Vance's script perfectly. I used his phrases. I gave him credit every 3 sentences. I saw him relax in his chair, a smug, satisfied grin spreading across his face. He was actually enjoying it. He thought I was a beaten dog licking the hand that had kicked me. I could see the other grad students in the back rows. They looked disappointed. They had hoped I'd be the one to finally stand up to the Vance machine. And here I was, playing the loyal soldier. And now, I said, my voice shifting. I felt a cold, hard stone settle in my chest. We come to the core dataset, The primary evidence for the mapping protocol. I glanced at Vance. He nodded, gesturing for me to continue. This was the part he had scrubbed, the part he had copy-pasted into his book and his nature submission. I displayed the 3D model. The neon green pathways of the mouse brain glowed, beautiful and complex. The audience leaned in. It was a masterpiece of data visualization. This data, I said, my voice echoing, is often criticized for being too clean. In science, we look for the noise. We look for the artifacts. Because the noise tells you if the data is real or if it has been manufactured. Vance's grin faltered. He leaned forward, his brow furrowing. This wasn't in the script. Mr. Sato, Dr. Aris interrupted. Is this relevant to the methodology? It's essential, Dr. Aris, I said, because there is a unique signature in this data, a watermark that exists at the level of the raw sequencing logs. A signature that proves beyond any mathematical doubt exactly where and when this data was generated. I reached into my pocket and gripped the USB drive. Dr. Vance has claimed in his upcoming book and in his communications with the dean that this data was generated by him 2 years ago in his private facility. The room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpet. Vance stood up. His face was turning a mottled, angry purple. Kenji, that's enough. You're clearly under a great deal of stress. Dr. Aris, I suggest we adjourn this. I'm not finished, Harrison, I snapped. The use of his first name was like a slap. I plugged the USB drive into the port. If this is Dr. Vance's data, I said to the committee, then he should be able to explain the recurring thermal artifact in the 400th decimal point. He should be able to explain why the noise in the data set isn't random. I hit the trigger sequence, Control plus Shift plus S plus A plus ST plus O. The screen didn't just flicker, it transformed. The beautiful 3D brain dissolved into a wall of raw, scrolling code. It looked like the Matrix, thousands of lines of numbers flying past at a blinding speed. What is this, Dr. Miller? One of the committee members asked, leaning forward. This isn't a standard visualization. It's a Fourier transform of the raw noise, I explained, my voice calm and clinical. I'm stripping away the visual layers to show you the mathematical foundation. If the noise is natural, it will look like static. But if it's been watermarked, I hit the final key. The scrolling code froze. The computer began a high-intensity analysis. A progress bar appeared on the screen, decrypting watermark 40%, 70%, 100%. The static vanished. In its place, the screen filled with a single, repeating phrase in giant, stark white letters against a black background. Stolen from Sato. Stolen from Sato. Stolen from Sato. The auditorium gasped. It was a physical sound, a collective intake of breath. My mother let out a small, confused cry. My father stood up, his mouth open. Vance lunged for the podium. He's hacked it. This is a stunt. He's trying to discredit me with a virus. It's not a virus, Harrison, I shouted over the noise. I pulled out the stack of papers from my pocket, the raw source code. The mathematical fingerprint is embedded in every copy of the data you've touched. It's in the manuscript you sent to your publisher. It's in the files you sent to Nature this morning. If you generated this data 2 years ago, why does it have a watermark with my name on it that only reacts to a script I wrote last night? Vance reached the podium and tried to grab my laptop. I stepped back, holding it out of his reach. Get away from me, I yelled. Dr. Aris was on his feet now, his face pale. Dr. Vance, sit down, now! He's lying, Vance screamed. He had lost it. The polished, charismatic rock star was gone. He looked like a cornered animal. I made him. He was nothing. He was a lab rat. I gave him everything. You didn't give me the work, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that carried through the microphone. I did the work. You just tried to steal the soul of it. I turned back to the committee. I have the original hard drives, I said, not the ones I gave to Dr. Vance. The ones I kept hidden. They contain the logs of every temperature fluctuation in the lab for the last 5 years. They match the fingerprint in the data perfectly. Dr. Vance has no logs. He has no raw code. He only has the results he stole from my server. Vance was hyperventilating. He looked around the room, searching for an ally, but there were none. Dr. Aris was looking at the screen with an expression of pure academic horror. The other committee members were whispering frantically. The dean of research, who had been sitting in the back, stood up. He wasn't looking at Vance. He was looking at the lawyers he'd brought with him. "This defense is suspended," the dean said, his voice cold. "Dr. Vance, you will accompany me to the provost's office immediately. Mr. Sato, you will secure that laptop and those drives. They are now evidence in a formal university investigation." Vance tried to speak, but no sound came out. He looked at the screen that still screamed, "Stolen from Sato," in front of his peers, his bosses, and the world. He didn't walk out. He was led out. He looked small. He looked old. I stood at the podium, my heart racing, the adrenaline finally starting to ebb away. I felt like I was floating. I looked down at the third row. My father was still standing. He didn't understand the Fourier transform. He didn't understand the neural mapping, but he understood the screen. He looked at me, and he did something he hadn't done since I was a little boy. He pounded his fist against his chest, right over his heart, and nodded. I didn't win my PhD that day, not officially, but as I watched the campus security guards close the doors behind a broken Harrison Vance, I knew I had won something much more important. I had my name back. The silence that follows a massive explosion is often more haunting than the blast itself. After the dean led Vance out of the auditorium, the room didn't erupt into chaos. It stayed quiet. People gathered their bags in a sort of stunned trance. My peers, the other PhD candidates who had spent years under Vance's shadow, looked at me with a mixture of awe and terror. I had done the unthinkable. I had pulled the curtain back on the great wizard of the neuroscience department, and everyone was realizing just how hollow the man behind it really was. I didn't leave the podium for a long time. I just stood there, my hands resting on the cool wood, watching the screen slowly time out and go black. The investigation took 6 months. In the world of academia, that's lightning speed. The university's Internal Integrity Committee was joined by federal investigators from the NIH National Institutes of Health. When you mess with data that involves federal grant money, you aren't just breaking school rules, you're committing a crime. They tore Vance's life apart. They found that I wasn't the first. He had a pattern going back 15 years. He would identify the most talented, most isolated student in his lab, groom them, take their best work, and then either bury them or force them into low-level lab tech positions where they couldn't complain. There were 4 other former students who came forward once my story hit the academic news cycles. They had been living in silence, their careers stunted, thinking they were the only ones. Vance didn't go down quietly. He hired a high-priced legal team. They tried to argue that the ghost dataset was a form of entrapment. They tried to say that because I had poisoned the data, I was the one who was dishonest. But the fingerprint was undeniable. The Fourier transform proved that the data in his book manuscript, the manuscript he had submitted months before I ever made the ghost version, already contained the specific temperature glitch patterns that only I had documented in my private logs. It was a mathematical trap that couldn't be argued away. He had the stolen goods in his possession before the theft was even public. The university was forced to take drastic action to save its reputation. Dr. Harrison Vance was stripped of his tenure. He was fired for gross professional misconduct and financial fraud. The publisher canceled his book deal and pulped the advanced copies. Nature issued a formal retraction of his previous papers, a move that is basically the death penalty in the scientific world. He was ordered to pay back over $2 million in misused grant funds. Last I heard, he had moved to a small town in the Midwest, trying to find work as a private consultant. But in the age of Google, his name is radioactive. The Vance mapping protocol is now officially the Sato mapping protocol. As for me, the path was complicated. For a few weeks, I was the most famous grad student in America. It was exhausting. I didn't want to be a whistleblower. I just wanted to be a scientist. Dr. Aris called me into his office about a month after the defense. He looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. The department was in shambles, the funding was frozen, and the Vance lab was being dismantled. "Kenji," he said, sliding a folder across his desk, "the university has completed its audit of your independent work. We have verified your original raw logs from the hidden drives you provided. The committee has met in a special session." I opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of heavy parchment paper with the university seal in gold. "Doctor of Philosophy and Neuroscience, Kenji Sato, congratulations, doctor," Aris said, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of genuine respect in his eyes. "I'm sorry it took a war to get you here. I didn't stay at that university. I couldn't." Every hallway smelled of Vance's cologne, and every lab bench reminded me of the years I spent being livestock. I reached out to the team at Stanford. I expected them to be wary of me. After all, I was the guy who caused the scandal. But the head of the department there, a woman who had once been a rival of Vance's, called me personally. "Kenji," she said, "we don't care about the drama. We care about the math. That Fourier analysis you did during your defense, that was the most brilliant piece of data forensic work I've seen in 20 years. The job offer is back on the table, and this time we're adding a signing bonus." I moved to California 2 weeks later. My first day at Stanford, I walked into my new lab. It was bright, filled with windows, and smelled of nothing but fresh air and clean glass. I sat down at my desk and looked at the nameplate, Dr. Kenji Sato, principal investigator. I pulled a small framed photo out of my bag and set it on the desk. It was the photo my mom took at the defense. It's a bit blurry, but it captures the moment my dad stood up in the third row. He's looking at the screen, and even in the low light, you can see the pride in his eyes. Sometimes, I still have nightmares. I dream that I'm back in that airless basement, counting neurons for a man who doesn't know my name. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart hammering. But then I look at my hands. They don't shake anymore. I learned a hard lesson in that lab. I learned that academia isn't always about the truth. Sometimes it's about power. Sometimes it's about who has the loudest voice and the most expensive suit. But the data doesn't lie. Numbers have a way of sticking to the person who actually found them. You can steal a graph, you can steal a paragraph, and you can even steal a career. But you can't steal the fingerprint. You can't steal the hours of soul-crushing work that go into a discovery. I'm currently supervising my own first batch of grad students. On the first day, I brought them all into my office. I didn't give them a speech about changing the world or winning rockstar status. I didn't bring beer or try to be their cool dad. I sat them down and showed them the server. "This is your space," I told them. "You own your encryption keys. Your name goes first on every paper you write. And if you ever find an anomaly, a glitch, a bit of noise that doesn't make sense, don't hide it. Bring it to me, because that noise is where the truth lives." I looked at a young student in the front row. He reminded me of myself, quiet, diligent, a little bit desperate to prove he belonged. "And one more thing," I said, leaning forward. "Never ever let anyone tell you that you're just a lab assistant. In this room, you're a scientist. And your name belongs on the work." I think Vance is still out there somewhere, probably blaming me for everything he lost. But I don't think about him much anymore. I have too much work to do, and this time I'm doing it for myself.